The storm had already passed by the time they found her, but its cruelty still clung to the land. Snow lay in uneven drifts along the outskirts of town, crusted hard by the night's bitter cold. A ranch hand heading home spotted something dark against the white near the old cottonwood tree by the road. At first, he thought it was a fallen coat or a sack of grain abandoned by a careless traveler. Only when he drew closer did he see the shape of a woman. She was curled inward, as if trying to disappear into herself, her thin dress soaked and stiff with ice. Her boots were torn, her hands bare and cracked, her breath so shallow it was almost impossible to tell if she was alive. The man shouted for help, his voice cutting through the still morning air, and soon a small crowd gathered, curious, wary, whispering. No one recognized her. That fact settled over the group heavier than the cold. In a town where everyone knew each other's business, an unknown woman was not just a mystery, it was a problem. Someone suggested she must be a drifter. Another muttered that she had likely been abandoned for good reason. A few shook their heads and turned away, already deciding her fate without waiting for the truth. She was carried to the sheriff's office because there was nowhere else to take her. The boarding house refused responsibility. The church had no room. The poorhouse lay 2 days' ride away, and she would never survive the journey in her condition. So she was laid on a narrow cot near the stove, her body trembling despite the heat. Sheriff Caleb Holt arrived shortly after, removing his gloves as he took in the scene. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with lines etched deep around his eyes, lines carved by years of duty and a grief he never spoke of. He studied the woman quietly, noting the bruises hidden beneath grime, the scars that spoke of a hard life, the way her fingers twitched as if she expected pain even in sleep. "Anyone know her?" he asked. No one answered. The silence confirmed what he already suspected. No family had come running at the sound of the storm. No husband or brother had asked questions. No friend stood waiting with relief in their eyes. She was unclaimed in every sense of the word. The town doctor was summoned and did what he could: warm broth, clean bandages, stern warnings about how close she'd come to death. "Another hour out there," he said, "and you'd be digging a grave." Word spread quickly, as it always did. By midday, the sheriff's office buzzed with gossip. Some said she'd been left behind by a wagon train. Others insisted she was running from trouble and had brought it with her. The town council debated what should be done once she woke, already leaning toward sending her away. Caleb listened but did not join the speculation. He stood near the stove, watching the rise and fall of her chest. There was something about the way she clutched the blanket, as if afraid it might be taken from her, that unsettled him. He had seen criminals, liars, and con artists in his years as sheriff, but he had also seen fear born from abandonment, and this looked like that. As evening fell, the woman stirred. Her lashes fluttered, and a faint sound escaped her lips, not a word, but a fragile breath that proved she was still fighting to stay in the world. Caleb felt an unexpected tightening in his chest. No one had come to claim her. And for reasons he couldn't yet explain, the sheriff knew he would not let her be discarded like the storm's aftermath. Morning light crept through the frosted windows of the sheriff's office, pale and weak, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Sheriff Caleb Holt had not slept. He sat at his desk with a cold cup of coffee untouched at his elbow, his attention drawn again and again to the narrow cot near the stove where the unknown woman lay. She was still unconscious, but her breathing had strengthened overnight. The doctor's words echoed in Caleb's mind. She was close to dying. Too close. He had seen death often in his years as sheriff, yet something about how narrowly she escaped it weighed on him in a way he couldn't dismiss. Caleb was a man shaped by loss. 3 winters ago, he had buried his wife, Margaret, after a fever swept through town. No matter how many laws he enforced or nights he spent keeping order, nothing had prepared him for the silence she left behind. Since then, he had lived alone, moving through his days with duty as his shield and distance as his habit. Compassion, when allowed too close, still hurt. Yet this woman, unclaimed, nameless, forgotten, had slipped past those defenses. When the town council arrived later that morning, their boots tracked snow across the floor as they gathered, their expressions tight with concern that had little to do with her welfare. They spoke in low, urgent voices about responsibility and reputation. "We can't keep her here indefinitely," one man said. "If no one claims her, she becomes the town's burden. Send her to the poorhouse once she can stand," another added. "It's not our problem how she ended up here." Caleb listened without interruption. When they finally turned to him, expecting agreement, he rose slowly from his chair. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of authority earned over years of service. "She nearly died on our doorstep," he said. "Until we know who she is and what happened to her, she stays." The room fell quiet. No one challenged him outright. They rarely did. Caleb Holt was not a loud man, but when he decided something, he did not waver. After they left, Caleb returned to the stove. He adjusted the blanket around the woman's shoulders with careful hands, as if afraid to wake her. In that small, ordinary gesture, something stirred an ache he thought he had buried alongside his wife. Later that afternoon, her eyes finally opened. They were wary eyes, dark and unfocused at first, darting around the room as though searching for threats. When they landed on Caleb, she stiffened, pulling the blanket tighter. "You're safe," he said gently, surprised by the softness of his own voice. "You were found outside town. You're in the sheriff's office." She tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. Caleb fetched water and helped her sip it, careful not to touch more than necessary. Even so, she flinched at his closeness, and that small reaction told him more than words ever could. "Do you remember your name?" he asked. There was a long pause. Fear flickered across her face before she nodded faintly. "Eliza," she whispered. Nothing else came. No family name. No place. No one waiting. As the doctor confirmed her condition later malnourished, exhausted, but healing, Caleb stood by the window, watching townsfolk pass outside. He knew what they would say once word spread that she was awake. Questions would turn to judgment. Sympathy would sour into suspicion. And still, no one came asking for her. That night, as Caleb locked up the office, he realized something unsettling. He felt responsible for her in a way the law did not require. Not because it was his duty as sheriff, but because he recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same look he saw in the mirror every morning. The look of someone left behind, surviving because there was no other choice. Eliza woke the next morning to the sound of voices drifting in from the street below. Wagons creaked, horses snorted, and somewhere a child laughed. The ordinary rhythm of the town felt unreal, as though life had continued without noticing how close she had come to vanishing entirely. She lay still, afraid that if she moved, someone would remember she did not belong there. Sheriff Holt came in not long after sunrise, carrying a small tray with bread and broth. He moved with quiet purpose, never rushing, never looming over her. Eliza watched him from beneath her lashes, measuring him the way she had learned to measure all men by tone, by distance, by the way they held their hands. "Morning," he said simply. "You're stronger today." She nodded, her fingers tightening around the blanket. Strength felt like a fragile thing, easily taken away. She accepted the broth, sipping carefully, her eyes never leaving his face. He asked gentle questions, giving her time between each one. Where had she come from? How long had she been traveling? Had anyone been with her before the storm? Eliza tried to answer. Truly, she did. But when she reached for her memories, they scattered like startled birds. There were flashes, running feet, a raised voice, the sting of cold, but no clear path leading backward. Each attempt left her breathless and trembling. "I don't remember," she finally whispered. "I only know my name, Eliza." Caleb did not press. He had seen fear seize people before, and he recognized it now in the way her shoulders hunched, as if bracing for punishment. Instead, he nodded and stood, giving her space. By midday, the news had spread. The woman was awake, and she had no story. That made her dangerous in the town's eyes. Women passing the sheriff's office slowed their steps, peering up at the window with narrowed gazes. Men lingered longer than necessary, curiosity tinged with something less kind. In a place where a person's history was their currency, Eliza had nothing to offer, and that made people uneasy. The town council returned, sharper this time. "If she can't account for herself," one of them said, "we can't keep her." She could be anyone, a thief, a fallen woman. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Or someone who nearly froze to death and deserves time," he replied. Their arguments went nowhere, but the tension settled into the walls like dampness. Eliza sensed it even without hearing the words. When Caleb returned to her later, she spoke before he could. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said, panic rising in her voice. "I can leave. I'll find somewhere else." "You can barely stand," he said. "You're not going anywhere." She stared at him, confusion and disbelief warring in her eyes. No one had ever insisted she stay before, not when staying cost them something. That evening, as shadows stretched long and the stove crackled softly, Eliza sat up on the cot, hugging her knees. She watched the sheriff right at his desk, the lamplight outlining his worn features. He looked like a man used to standing alone. When he finally looked up, their eyes met. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a quiet understanding. She had a name but no past. He had a past that haunted him and a present built on duty alone. Outside, the town continued to wait for someone to come claim Eliza, but no one did. The decision came quietly, without ceremony or witnesses, the way most life-altering choices do. Sheriff Caleb Holt stood at the foot of the stairs behind the office, keys heavy in his hand, listening to the low murmur of voices outside. The town was restless. It always grew uneasy when something didn't fit neatly into its rules. Eliza had spent another night on the narrow cot by the stove, waking at every sound, her body still convinced danger lingered just beyond the walls. By morning, the council's message was clear. If she remained in the sheriff's office, she would be considered in custody. A woman without a past, they said, could not simply stay on goodwill. Caleb refused to see her as a prisoner. He climbed the stairs and opened the door to the small room above the office, a space long unused since his wife's death. Dust coated the windowsill, and the air smelled faintly of old pine and memories he rarely allowed himself to touch. The bed was simple, the quilt folded neatly at the foot, just as Margaret had left it. When he returned downstairs, Eliza was sitting upright, her hands folded in her lap like a child awaiting judgment. Fear flickered across her face when she saw his expression, too serious, too resolved. "You're not under arrest," he said before she could speak. "And you're not going to the poorhouse." Her eyes widened. "Then, what happens to me?" Caleb hesitated, aware of the weight of what he was about to offer. "I have a spare room upstairs," he said. "It's not a cell, it's a room. You can stay there until you're on your feet." For a long moment, she didn't respond. Her lips parted, then pressed together again, as if words had failed her. Finally, she shook her head slightly, disbelief etched into every line of her face. "Why?" she asked. Caleb didn't have a simple answer. He could say it was practical, that it kept her safe and quieted the council. But the truth ran deeper, into places he rarely explored. "Instead," he said, "because you need a place to rest." "And because I can." He led her upstairs slowly, careful of her weakened steps. At the doorway, Eliza stopped. She took in the bed, the window, the small table with a wash basin, ordinary things that felt impossibly precious. Her fingers brushed the quilt and she swallowed hard. "No one's ever given me a room before," she said softly. That admission struck Caleb harder than any accusation. He nodded once and left her to settle in, closing the door gently behind him. Days passed in quiet routines. Eliza rested, cleaned the small space, and helped where she could, folding papers, sweeping the stairs, bringing coffee when her strength allowed. Each task seemed to ground her, as though purpose itself was a kind of healing. At night, she sat by the window, watching the town below. The fear did not vanish, but it loosened its grip. For the first time in years, she slept without one eye open. Caleb noticed the change, too. He found himself listening for her footsteps, checking that the lamp upstairs was lit. The emptiness he'd grown accustomed to shifted, not gone, but altered. The town still whispered. A woman living above the sheriff's office invited speculation. But Caleb stood firm, and Eliza stayed where she was, no longer confined, no longer discarded. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was shelter. And for Eliza, that was the beginning of something entirely new. Safety, Eliza learned, was not the same as acceptance. From the window of her small room above the sheriff's office, she could see how the town watched her now. Conversation stopped when she passed. Doors closed a little too quickly. Women gathered their children closer, while men let their gazes linger in ways that made her skin prickle. She was no longer invisible, but she was not welcome either. When she was strong enough, Eliza insisted on finding work. She did not want charity, no matter how gently it was given. Caleb tried to dissuade her at first, knowing what waited beyond his protection, but he saw the resolve in her eyes. Work meant dignity. It meant survival on her own terms. The boarding house was her first attempt. The owner barely let her finish speaking before shaking her head. "I can't hire someone with no references," she said, her eyes flicking toward the sheriff's badge as if daring trouble. People talk. The general store was no better. The shopkeeper asked questions Eliza couldn't answer: where she was from, who her people were, why she'd been found half dead outside town. When she faltered, his expression hardened. "I can't take risks," he said, already turning away. By the third rejection, Eliza's hands were shaking not from weakness, but from humiliation. Each refusal chipped away at the fragile confidence she'd begun to build. Old instincts stirred, urging her to pack up and leave before she could be pushed out. That was when the trouble started. A group of boys followed her down the street, their laughter sharp and unkind. One tossed a pebble that struck her shoulder. Another called out a name she didn't recognize but understood by its tone alone. Eliza quickened her pace, heart pounding, shame burning hot behind her eyes. The laughter stopped abruptly at the sound of boots. Sheriff Holt stepped into the street, his presence commanding silence without a word. He looked at the boys, then at their parents watching from nearby porches. "Go home," he said calmly. "And if I hear of this happening again, there will be consequences." The boys scattered. The parents looked away. Eliza stood frozen, torn between gratitude and embarrassment. Caleb turned to her, his voice low. "You all right?" She nodded, though her throat felt tight. "I don't want to be the reason people hate you," she said. "You're not," he replied. "They're choosing that themselves." That evening, the town council confronted him again. They spoke of propriety, of how his leniency set a dangerous example. One man went so far as to suggest Eliza was manipulating him. Caleb's temper flared then, rare and sharp. "She's done nothing wrong," he said, "and I won't punish her because this town prefers its comfort over its conscience." Word of that exchange spread, and with it, a subtle shift. Not kindness, but caution. People stopped harassing Eliza openly. They learned that the law, at least, stood on her side. Still, the weight of judgment pressed in from all directions. Eliza felt it in every glance, every silence. Yet each night she returned to her room, closed the door, and breathed. She had endured worse than whispers. And for the first time, someone was standing between her and the cruelty of the world, even when it cost him something. Winter loosened its grip slowly, as if reluctant to release the town from its hold. The days grew longer, the cold less sharp, but the night still carried echoes of loss. It was during one of those quiet evenings that the distance between Eliza and Sheriff Holt finally began to close. They sat in the office after supper, the lamplight soft, the streets outside hushed. Eliza had finished helping with the day's paperwork, her movements more confident now, her shoulders no longer drawn so tightly inward. Caleb poured coffee for them both, a simple habit that felt strangely intimate. For a while neither spoke. Silence, Eliza had learned, could be dangerous, but this one felt different. It wasn't heavy with threat. It was careful, respectful. "You don't have to stay down here," Caleb said at last. "You've done enough for today." "I know," she replied. "I just don't mind the quiet." Her honesty surprised him. He studied her face, noticing how the shadows under her eyes had faded, how her gaze no longer darted toward the door at every sound. Healing, he realized, was not sudden. It arrived in small, almost invisible ways. After a moment, Eliza spoke again, her voice hesitant. "People say you lost your wife." The words hung between them. Caleb felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the instinct to shut the door on that part of himself. But something in her expression, gentle, unassuming, made him stay present. "Yes," he said, 3 years ago. Fever took her in less than a week. "I'm sorry," Eliza said simply. He nodded, staring into his cup. "She was the reason I stayed in this town, the reason I became sheriff. After she died, everything else just became habit." Eliza listened without interrupting. When she spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "I think that's how I've been living, too. Just habit, just surviving." She hesitated, then continued. "I don't remember my past clearly, but I remember being left. Over and over. People deciding I wasn't worth keeping." The confession cost her. Her hands trembled, and she folded them tightly together, bracing for disbelief or pity. Instead, Caleb looked at her with something like recognition. "Loss doesn't always leave marks you can see," he said. "Sometimes it just teaches you to expect more of it." The words struck deep. Eliza felt tears rise, not sharp, panicked ones, but slow, aching tears that surprised her with their warmth. She brushed them away, embarrassed. "You don't have to be strong here," Caleb said quietly. "Not all the time." No one had ever said that to her before. They sat there, two people bound by different kinds of grief, finding unexpected comfort in shared understanding. Nothing improper passed between them. No promises were made, yet something shifted, subtle but undeniable. For Caleb, the house above the office no longer felt haunted. For Eliza, the fear of being sent away eased just a little. Outside, the wind stirred, carrying the scent of thawing earth. Neither of them noticed when the clock struck midnight. They only knew that, for the first time in a long while, they were not alone with their pain. The stranger arrived on a gray afternoon, riding into town with the confidence of someone who believed he belonged wherever he chose to stand. His coat was worn but well kept, his boots polished enough to suggest recent money, and his eyes sharp and restless missed very little. He asked questions at the saloon first, then the general store. By the time he reached the sheriff's office, his purpose had already begun to ripple through the town. "I'm looking for a woman," he said to the deputy, his mouth curving into something that resembled a smile. "Goes by the name Eliza." Eliza heard the name from upstairs and felt the blood drain from her face. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up, heart racing, breath shallow, hands numb. A memory stirred, not whole but violent in its fragments, shouting. A grip on her arm, the sense of being cornered with no way out. She backed away from the door, her legs trembling, every instinct screaming the same command she had followed all her life. "Run." Caleb came out of his office. At the sound of the stranger's voice, One look at the man, at the way his gaze lifted toward the stairs, and Caleb felt a warning settle deep in his gut. "State your business," Caleb said evenly. The man tipped his hat. "Name's Thomas Rourke. I believe the woman you're sheltering belongs with me." The word belongs rang like a gunshot. Caleb's expression hardened. "She's not property," he said. "And she hasn't claimed anyone." Rourke chuckled softly. "That's her way?" Always forgetting what's convenient. Upstairs, Eliza pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from crying out. The room felt too small, the walls closing in. She could hear his voice clearly now, each word tightening the knot of fear in her chest. Caleb stepped closer to Rourke, his voice low and dangerous. "You'll choose your next words carefully." Rourke met his gaze, unafraid. "She ran from me months ago, took money that wasn't hers. I've been looking ever since." "That's not true," Eliza whispered to herself, though doubt clawed at her. Had she run? Had she taken something just to survive? Her memory refused to give her answers, only fear. The confrontation ended without violence, but not without damage. Rourke left with a warning smile, promising he would return with proof, with witnesses, with the law, if needed. When Caleb climbed the stairs afterward, he found Eliza crouched on the floor beside the bed, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. The sight struck him harder than any threat Rourke had made. "He knows me," she said before he could speak, her voice shaking. "I don't remember how, but I know he's dangerous." Caleb knelt a few feet away, careful not to crowd her. "Did he hurt you?" Tears spilled freely now. "I don't know. I just know I was afraid. And I still am." That night, Eliza packed her few belongings with frantic urgency. She folded the quilt, smoothed the pillow, and left the room exactly as she had found it. Habit again. Survival again. "I have to go," she told Caleb, standing at the foot of the stairs. "I won't bring trouble to your door." "Not after everything you've done." Caleb felt anger rise not at her, but at a world that had taught her to disappear at the first sign of danger. "Running won't protect you," he said. "It never does. It's all I know," she replied. For a long moment they stood there, the space between them heavy with unsaid things. Caleb thought of Margaret, of the times he wished he fought harder against fate instead of accepting it quietly. He would not make that mistake again. "No one gets to claim you," he said firmly. "Not him. Not anyone." Eliza searched his face, disbelief giving way to something fragile and desperate. "Hope." Caleb straightened, resolve settling into place. "If Rourke comes back, he answers to me. And if he's lying, I'll prove it." For the first time since the stranger arrived, Eliza loosened her grip on her bag. She didn't run, not yet. Rourke's shadow lingered long after he rode out of town. Even when the streets were quiet and the sky cleared, Eliza felt as though she were being watched. Every footstep outside made her flinch. Every knock sent her heart racing. Fear urged her to leave while she still could, to disappear before the past caught up and swallowed her whole. But Caleb did not treat her fear as inconvenience or weakness. He doubled patrols near the office, spoke to the deputy in clipped, serious tones, and made it clear to anyone who asked that Eliza was under his protection, not as a suspect, not as a burden, as a person. When Rourke returned 2 days later, he brought papers and a pair of rough-looking men, expecting intimidation to do the rest. Caleb met him in the street, calm and immovable. He examined the documents carefully, asked questions Rourke hadn't anticipated, and pointed out inconsistencies that unraveled the man's story piece by piece. By the time witnesses from a neighboring town were found, men who recognized Rourke as a gambler known for false claims and intimidation, the crowd's attention shifted. Murmurs turned against him. Confidence drained from his posture. "You'll leave," Caleb said quietly, his hand resting near his holster. "And if you return, it will be in irons." Rourke spat in the dirt and retreated, his threats reduced to empty promises. The danger passed not with a gunshot, but with truth brought into the light. Eliza watched from the window above, her knees weak with relief. For the first time, someone had stood between her and the world and won. That night, she stood in the doorway of her room, her packed bag at her feet. She stared at it for a long time, remembering all the other times she'd run before she could be forced out. Leaving had always felt like control. Staying felt terrifying. Caleb waited below, giving her space as he always did. Finally, Eliza carried the bag downstairs, not to leave, but to set it beside the stairs. "I'm tired of running," she said, her voice steady despite the fear still pulsing beneath it. "If trouble comes, I want to face it here." Caleb nodded, pride and relief flickering across his face. "You won't face it alone." Word spread quickly. The town, shamed by the exposure of Rourke's lies, grew quieter. Not kinder, perhaps, but less cruel. Some looks softened, some doors opened a crack wider. Eliza slept deeply that night, her bag untouched. She had chosen to stay. And in doing so, she claimed something she had never truly had before, a place where she belonged, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she wanted to be there. Spring arrived in earnest, bringing green shoots through thawed earth and a cautious optimism to the town. With the threat of Rourke gone, life settled into a gentler rhythm. For Eliza, the days no longer felt borrowed. They felt lived. It began with the schoolhouse. The teacher, a stern woman with tired eyes, had watched the events around Eliza with quiet interest. One morning she stopped Eliza on the street. "I could use help," she said plainly. "The children need more patience than I have some days." Eliza accepted before fear could talk her out of it. Working at the schoolhouse changed her. Children asked fewer questions about the past and cared little for gossip. They accepted her kindness without suspicion, returned it with laughter and trust. Eliza found herself smiling more, standing straighter, discovering that she was capable of gentleness without expecting punishment in return. The town noticed. People still watched her, but now there were nods instead of stares. Mothers thanked her for helping their children learn to read. Shopkeepers spoke to her without edge. Acceptance did not arrive all at once, but it came. Caleb saw the difference most clearly in the evenings. Eliza returned tired but content, sharing small stories from her day. He listened, offering dry humor and steady encouragement. Their conversations grew easier, warmer, filled with companionable silences that no longer felt heavy. One afternoon, Caleb watched from across the street as Eliza helped a frightened child across a muddy patch of road, lifting her skirts without complaint, laughing when both ended up splattered. Something settled in his chest then, a sense of rightness he hadn't felt since before Margaret's illness. He struggled with it. Loyalty to the past still tugged at him. Loving again felt like betrayal. Yet grief, he was learning, did not demand a lifetime of loneliness. It asked only to be honored, not obeyed. Eliza felt the change, too. She no longer packed her belongings at night. The room above the office was hers in more than name. She planted flowers in the window box, hung a borrowed curtain, left her shoes by the door without fear they would be taken. For the first time, she imagined a future not as an escape, but as something worth building. The town council, sensing the shift, eased their pressure. Eliza was no longer a question mark. She was useful, respected. Slowly, she became known. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the street in gold, Eliza and Caleb stood outside the office, watching the town wind down. Their shoulders nearly touched. "I never thanked you," Eliza said quietly, "for giving me a chance to stay." Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her. "You did the hard part," he replied. "You stayed." In that moment, both understood something important. This was no longer about shelter or protection. Eliza had found a place in the world, and Caleb, without realizing it at first, had begun to find one too. Summer came softly, as though the land itself was careful not to disturb the fragile happiness that had taken root. The town no longer whispered Eliza's name with suspicion. It spoke it with familiarity. She belonged now not because she had proven herself useful, but because she had been allowed to become herself. One evening, after the heat of the day had faded, Caleb stood alone in the room above the office. The window was open, the curtains stirring in the breeze, and the flowers Eliza had planted nodded gently in the fading light. The space no longer felt like a memorial to his past. It felt alive. He knew then what he had been circling for months. When Eliza returned from the schoolhouse, dust on her skirts and a tired smile on her face, Caleb met her at the foot of the stairs. There was no badge in his hand, no authority in his posture, only honesty. "I offered you a room because you needed safety," he said. "I kept offering it because I needed purpose." Somewhere along the way that changed. Eliza's breath caught. She waited, afraid to hope. "You don't owe me anything," Caleb continued. "But if you're willing, I'd like to offer you more than shelter, not out of duty, out of choice." Tears filled her eyes, not from fear this time, but from the overwhelming gentleness of being asked instead of claimed. She thought of the storm, the cold, the days when she had been nothing more than an unclaimed body by the road. She thought of running, of hiding, of surviving alone. And she thought of this place, this man, this life she had slowly, bravely built. "I've spent my whole life being left," she said softly. "I don't want to run anymore." Caleb reached for her hand, stopping just short, giving her the space to decide. When she placed her hand in his, it felt like a promise freely given. They married quietly that fall, without spectacle or scandal. The town attended not out of curiosity, but respect. Eliza stood tall beside Caleb, no longer afraid of being seen. She had been unclaimed once. Now she was chosen. Not as a possession, not as a burden, but as a partner, a home, and a reason to stay.